Testing.
I can hear you and see you.
Thank you. Mr. Mansholt, I was wondering if you could let us know who from public service might want sharing access so Ms. Federico could enable them.
Yeah, John, you're going to share our PowerPoint? I'm sorry, it looks like my mic was just on there, Commissioner Gilman.
Yeah.
Our subject matter expert, Mr. John Kern, will be sharing our presentation, so we'll need to get him access if he doesn't already have it.
Okay. All right. So Ms. Federico, it sounds like if you can get Mr. Kern access for the beginning of the meeting, at least that would be helpful. Okay. That was all
Thank
I
you.
wanted to know just to get us set up.
Sure.
I have set it up where Mr. Kern has access. Let me know if they can't figure it out or it's not working.
Looks like we got it. Thank you.
Good morning. Ms. Federico, are we all set to go?
Yes, sorry, I lost my mouse. We're all set.
No, you're good. Good morning. We are now on the record. This is a technical conference in proceeding number 24M-0493G. In this proceeding, the commission is identifying and investigating the cost causation of residential development and other development of Public Service Company of Colorado's gas utility operations pursuant to 40-3-121 CRS. The commission must complete this analysis pursuant to SB 23-291. The purpose of today's hearing is to better understand the company's permanent variance motion filed on May 19th, 2015, in response to decision number R23-0316I. It is 9 a.m. on June 6th, 2015, maybe 2025. And I'm Commissioner Megan Gilman, the hearing commissioner for this proceeding. I've been designated by a vote of the 3 commissioners to hear this matter and to issue a recommended decision for consideration by the full commission. Through its motion filed on May 19th, the company requested modification to the data request directives and associated timelines required by the commission decision in this proceeding. I plan to focus on the technical aspects of the variance motion and red line requests and not on the legal merits of the motion. I will not rule on the merits of the motion today, but plan to use today to discuss the red line request by the company in its motion. Today's conversation will be with representatives from the company only. For those listening in today but not on the speaker agenda, we will welcome written comments in response to anything you hear today or more generally on the topics in this proceeding. Written comments can be filed directly into this proceeding, which again is number 24M-0493G through the Commission's e-filings website. I know there's a lot going on right now, but I do anticipate ruling on this motion in the next week or so to keep this moving along. So if any other interested party is listening or plans to file comments either anywhere as a result of today's technical conference, I would just communicate to you that time is of the essence with your comments if you want them to come in prior to a ruling on this motion. This hearing is being webcast on the internet. It will be live at all times, even during any breaks. So please be mindful of your video and microphone at all times. First I want to start by saying I appreciate the company providing in advance notice prior to the actual variance filing that it would be forthcoming. While the actual variance was filed fairly recently, it was nice to have that heads up, so I do appreciate that. I understand just about everyone involved here is very busy right now, so I'll try to be expedient with our time today. Hope this may not last all the way until 11 o'clock today, but I didn't want to cut us short and not plan in enough time to get through all the content. So things go smoothly, we're very efficient with our time. We may well be able to end early here today in advance of the 11 o'clock time window that we had allotted. So my objective today is to better understand the company's variance request and to get what we think we absolutely need and as much as we can to ensure that we can complete our statutory obligations related to the cost causation study from Senate Bill 291. Our goal is to have a technically sound investigation, including the areas required by the legislation. So we'll have to sort through some of this data today and see what is really available and what is not. To that end, it's critical to me in conducting this study that we get candid access to project technical and financial information in order to fulfill our obligations and to do so in the most technically rigorous and accurate manner for this legislatively directed work. So we'll be trying to sort some of that out today. An interim decision 24M-0493G issued May 29th of this year, which established this technical conference. I ordered the company to begin compiling portions of the data request that the company has not disputed and identified several large gas infrastructure projects which definitively should be included, even while we meet today. And I work over the next week or so to fully respond to each of the facets of the company's request. Also appreciate the company's suggestion or offering to hold a technical workshop in this matter. Sometimes it is more efficient to just get together and hash something out in a quicker manner than kind of repeated rounds of filings. So I appreciate that suggestion and hopeful that this venue today will be very helpful in that regard to move us forward in a common understanding of where we can get. So it's my understanding that the company has some slides to start us off today. So happy to welcome, hi, Mr. Matley. Happy to welcome you all to do that. It's certainly my hope, Mr. Matley, we don't take more than like 15 minutes at the max to do that. And that we keep things as pertinent to the motion and each of those requests as possible so we can be efficient with our time. After that presentation, I intend to move us in a discussion more or less down the list of that data request in order so I can better understand your red lines and your actual data and technical capabilities and tick those off one by one and move through if that works for you.
That does. And I appreciate it, Commissioner Gilman. Appreciate you taking us up on the offer of a technical conference because I do agree that I think it'll be more efficient to talk through some of the changes that we proposed. And to aid in that, we have prepared these slides and this content to kind of help set the stage and help, talk about our objectives, which I think are very much shared with the objectives that you outlined in terms of getting to a set of data that's going to be responsive and help you complete the cost causation study while also being sort of sets of data that we can readily provide. So we have, these prepared remarks. We're endeavoring not to take more than 15 minutes to talk through it and leave the majority of the time for questions and answers. And so I think we can jump right in and move to the next slide, in which, we'll just give you a lay of the land in terms of who we have here today. So the experts that we've made available, we have Grace Jones, who is going to be able to speak to overall our business processes in the gas new business and capacity planning organization, or those processes. Also about non-pipeline alternatives, which I know you've spoken with her in the past about, and cost benefit analysis. We also have Mladen Gajic here, who can speak to hydraulic modeling and the data requests dependent upon that hydraulic modeling. And then myself as well, Ryan Matley, and I can speak to you about anything regarding regulatory policy or the revenue requirements and cost of service elements of the data request. And so with that, we can move on and talk a little bit about I think this echoes what you said at the outset. We wanted to let you know our understanding of, our objective here in this technical conference and how it relates to the revisions that we put forward into the data decision. And so we're hoping, to have a productive, collaborative conversation to be able to get to a place where we have a kind of shared understanding of the objectives of the cost causation study that's going to allow us to provide a robust set of data to support that study and do that in a form in which we can provide it. And so we want to provide a little bit more context behind some of the challenges and complexities that we saw in developing responses to the data points requested in the original decision. And helping us understand better your perspective as well in terms of the objectives of the study will, I think, be an important piece to coming to a collaborative result at the end of this workshop. So that's our objective and goals here today. And then to talk a little bit more about what went into the scope refinement we put forward and sort of what are the elements of the scope refinement that we put forward to the data decision. And it's really, almost 4 different categories here. of modifications that we made. So I think you saw, we made obviously red line changes to the data decision to strike certain provisions or modify certain provisions. And really that was intended to better align the data decision with the types of data we have available and that we can provide. And so, in order to get there, the company, based on the original data decision, we gathered a team of multiple subject matter experts and went through many hours of meetings and offline work to literally look at the data decision line by line and understand what data we had available, as well as what other, when we didn't have the data available, what sort of creative solutions or alternative pieces of data did we think we could readily provide that would meet our understanding of the objectives of the cost causation study. So that's, what sort of went into revising, redlining the data decision. And paired with that was reducing the number of projects from the 25 that was originally proposed down to 15. And that's really in recognition of the scope of the data request. And even with, revisions to the data request to make it more aligned with data we have readily available, most of these line items sort of fall into the category of special study, if I were to use the discovery process term, that it's information we can create, but we don't have it readily available in the form that it was requested. And so there are just a number of hours of work involved in putting it together. And so that's, that kind of reality on our side is what went into revising the number of projects as well as extending the timelines. Because as we'll talk through, and I think as you alluded to already, and know there's a number of other matters, ongoing that's pulling on some of the same experts that we need to provide responses to these data requests. And then, a key item to call out as well. We've proposed some what we think are reasonable assumptions on the NPA analysis or alternatives analysis piece of the data request as well that can really, from our standpoint, help expedite the creation and submission of this data while without sort of undercutting, we think, any of the objectives of the cost causation study. So that's some of the thought process and some of the background that went into this scope refinement. And then if we can move to the next slide, I won't belabor this. You mentioned it. We've talked about it as well in the motion for variance, but there are a number of things going on that's the gas organization in particular is involved in, both at the commission and just in the business itself. So, we've put up here the timelines for, this current proceeding, the cost causation M docket, as well as obviously we just filed our gas infrastructure plan just 2 weeks ago now. And ongoing, we have the Mountain Energy project proceeding, as well as a gas depreciation study that are currently before the commission. And of course, the beyond the regulatory calendar, the folks in the gas organization and in the integrated systems planning organization are in the midst of updating their models and doing verifications to prepare for upcoming winter operations. And and paired with that will be the annual design day planning process to kick off. So my colleagues can certainly talk to you more about that, but obviously there's more happening than just in front of the commission. So with that, we can move to the next slide and just talk about a little bit more of a high level. I think we will dive into the details when we get through this presentation and get into the questions. But at a high level, in some of these categories, we want to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the revisions we put forward and why those are the case. And it really falls back to the fact that some of the data that was requested is just not data that we have in our possession, or is not documented as part of our existing or then existing business processes. And so we've made an attempt to identify alternative sets of data that we think is responsive to meeting the objective of the cost causation study. So some examples of that, on the revenue and revenue requirement side, we think the first best data source for evaluating the revenue associated with new business projects is the actual revenue from those developments. There are many instances where that's not yet available. The development takes time to reach full build out after the gas infrastructure is installed. And to have data available, you generally need a year's worth of occupancy after full build out. So depending on the timeline of some of these developments, there's not a full data set of actuals available that's representative of where that development might be at full build out. So in instances like that, we think maybe some proxy calculated revenue data might be a suitable alternative. We also have, to determine if or how to assign incremental O&M to the revenue requirement of each project. It's a topic we've talked about, I think, in the last gas rate case as well, that on an individual project basis, it's hard to kind of identify specific O&M costs. But when you zoom out and look at a number of different projects and potential growth of our system, then you could reasonably say there are, O&M impacts in there. So how to assign that incremental O&M, how to determine that, what types of projects is it reasonable to do that, and what times might it not be, is another one of those challenges that we're working through. And then I think to speak to these other challenges, I'll turn it over to the experts in those areas. And so I think next with gas modeling will be Mladen.
Hi. So on the gas modeling side, in cases where actuals don't exist, we can use modeling as a substitute for that data. So for example, for most customers, we only have monthly meter read data rather than hourly data. So to provide peak hour load, we can get to an estimated design day peak hour load through performing calculations based on the monthly meter read actuals within our Synergy Gas customer management module.
Awesome. Thanks, Mladen, and good morning, everybody. Touching on non-pipeline alternatives a little bit, I might refer to those as NPAs. The company did develop an alternative proposal for NPA analysis. A typical NPA analysis for a new gas infrastructure project could take up to about 3 months per project. And that's really because we do the due diligence of diving into individual NPA measures and technologies, and then also evaluate the potential, so technical, achievable, sometimes economic potential. In this case, in order to develop a great number of NPAs quickly, the company has put together a proposal that we feel is aligned with the ultimate outcome of the cost causation docket. And so as such, as part of performing the NPA analysis, we have proposed some simplifying assumptions that we think will result in kind of the same level of end products that could be valuable to the commission and us as well. So in doing that, we have proposed that for the cost of the NPA portfolio, in lieu of looking at it at an individual measure basis, we make the assumption that the equivalent cost of the NPA portfolio is that of what we saw for the gas infrastructure project that we are currently doing, or doing the review on. Additionally, in regards to the incremental electric demand, we are going to be making or proposing to make the assumption that we assume that the equivalent electric demand is equivalent to the capacity shortfall that was solved for from either the new business or capacity expansion project. After those kind of simplifying steps, we are proposing that we do perform a full cost benefit analysis on those NPA portfolios compared to the gas infrastructure project. And in doing so, we are proposing that we do that in alignment with the company's current cost benefit analysis, or CBA handbook. So if we can move forward to the next slide, and I believe this is our last slide, I wanted to touch just briefly on the company's existing new business request process. And this has evolved a little bit over the last couple of years, but is generally representative of what you can expect. And wanted to use this as an opportunity to inform on some of the information that is readily available as we get into the discussion on different items that might require a little bit more creative solution. So in general, the company processes about 1,000+ new business requests per month. And as part of the process, the very first initiating step is actually the potential new gas customer submitting a request. In order to ensure that we are able to serve them reliably at design day conditions, the company really requests kind of 4 main pieces of data, and that includes the customer name, the location at which they desire to build, their requested in-service date, and then very important is the design day peak hour gas demand that they are requesting. And because that's really an informative input into our model to ensure that we're able to provide that safe and reliable service. Following that step, we input that through our builder's call line, and it kind of takes like a tiered approach depending on the size of the request. So for anything less than 1 MFCFH, and I know MFCFH is an acronym that not everyone's familiar with, but that's kind of equivalent to the design day peak hour gas demand. And anything less than 1 would represent like a single house or even a single appliance that's coming onto the system. We go straight to on-site infrastructure design, and that is handled by our internal design group. If it is larger than 1 MFCFH but less than 10, so this would maybe represent a smaller development or one larger commercial development, it goes on to an additional step with our gas systems engineering, and they put that into the hydraulic model to identify distribution infrastructure that may be required in order to support that project. And then kind of the final tier of analysis is anything greater than 10. And that's where it goes to gas strategic planning, where we do an analysis on the high pressure and intermediate pressure system, again, to identify system impacts. So thought this was important to realize when we talk about hydraulic modeling, depending on the size of the load that's coming onto the system, we'll have various levels of analysis that has been done. Following these analyses to determine what potential infrastructure may be required to support this incremental demand, the design group then compiles all of this information and puts together a cost estimate for the new customer, as well as a construction agreement that talks about the phases of construction and when we can accommodate potential in-service date, and provides this to the customer. The customer at this point has an opportunity to accept the cost agreement and the construction agreement, but what often happens, particularly when we're talking with a large developer, is there may be some changes to the project. Either the peak hour gas demand went up or down, depending on their design, because during this process, they're figuring stuff out too. They're likely looking for what appliances they want to use. So most likely it's going to be an iterative process. In extreme cases, we're going back and rerunning this analysis, 10, 20 times to make sure that we have an agreed upon plan with that new business customer. And then hopefully, then we get to the point where the customer then can accept the cost agreement and the construction agreement. The final thing I want to mention on this slide, which makes kind of data gathering a little bit challenging, is this entire process usually takes place a minimum of a year, but could occur up to 2 years prior to the in-service date. So for some of the projects that are in question here that were included in perhaps the 2021 gas rate case, that means that this customer could have come to us in 2018, 2017. So we're really digging into the arsenal to find some of the information on these customers, which is possible, but could potentially add layers of complexity as we're gathering this data. And with that, Commissioner Gilman, I would welcome you back. I think that concludes our presentation, and we're available for questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thanks for introducing the team, Mr. Matley, so we know who we're talking to. And I think it's probably easiest just to have you all 3 live, and we'll run down the list of questions, and whoever can get to them gets to them. I also did want to let you know Ms. Katie Elder from Aspen Environmental Group, who's been retained as a consultant to help us with this study, is also on the Zoom here. And probably what we'll do is in each of the kind of like broad section of changes, I'll ask a few questions and then ask Ms. Elder if she has any additional kind of clarifying or technical questions, since she is definitely more in the technical weeds than I am, to assist me in seeing what we're sorting through, if that works for everyone. Okay, great. So let's start in going down with the change in the number of projects, which is kind of the first red line or first suggestion of the companies. Let me see. Okay, so first I want to say I appreciate the company offering to get started on some of the biggest projects while we sort out the remaining details of your request here on cutting down the total number of projects. So I did already include 11 projects, including essentially the 7 largest capacity expansion projects and the 4 largest new business projects. In that interim decision that was used to schedule this technical conference to ensure the company could be meaningfully moving forward in the short term here on collecting data. So first, I just wanted to ask, aside from some of the required details, which we'll get into, did the company have any questions on that request or on the included projects that came out in that interim decision, just to kind of level set as we start?
No questions in terms of those projects that you asked us to get started on. I think we, signals as much that we anticipated the largest projects to, be certain to be included. And so we've gotten started already in terms of working to gather that data on those 11.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure we didn't have a misunderstanding to start with. We're all starting in the same place. Okay, so as we sort out how many and which projects to evaluate, to me, there's actually some linkage here between the actual gross number of projects we're asking for, but also kind of a technical detail that was included elsewhere in our data request, which indicated that the company should identify any interrelated projects to the project that is being studied. And the idea there was, if we've got a capacity expansion project, which is actually in the same vicinity, serving basically the same set of customers as a new business project, which occurred a couple of years ago, that seems to me in the spirit of what the legislature is telling us to do, to really identify what are all the costs that have gone in to serving these new residential developments or other developments. So I just wanted to kind of understand how that would be viewed by the company, especially in the context of total number of projects, when I think there is a possibility that we pull on a thread of a project and see other projects there and other costs, which seems to me a critical part of this analysis to really understand what are we talking about in terms of cost to serve new development. So just wanted to kind of open a discussion there because it ties these two things together and could impact the total number of projects at the end of the day. So just wanted to get any of your kind of impressions on that, how that influences total projects and how you're viewing the interrelated project issue.
I'm happy to start on that and then welcome other of our experts to jump in. So what we were thinking of with the 15 projects we put forward was really those 15 projects represented a subset of the original projects you identified. And I think there's elements of the data decision that ask us to look at interrelated projects and go into the hydraulic model and look upstream, both in the model and sort of upstream or downstream in time to identify interrelated projects. And so I think the projects that we would identify as interrelated, would be projects that grow off of that 15. And so I think what we haven't, I guess, considered or contemplated is, do we then need or want to do additional analysis on like new projects identified that have come into the mix?
Right. Okay. Okay. So as you're seeing it as part of your request, we start with 15, but if we pull on a thread that, oh, it turns out this capital expansion project is also related, like literally the molecules would flow through a capacity expansion project that occurred in the immediately prior rate case or a new business project that was there, you would be endeavoring to investigate and identify that as part of the data request and then pull forth whatever kind of technical and economic understanding we have of that related project as well.
Well, and I guess maybe that's also a question in a sense. I think we would be endeavoring to identify those projects. It's maybe a point of potential clarity, like, is the data decision then requesting us to do the same type of analysis, on those identified additional projects? And I don't think That is something that we contemplated in putting forward the 15 projects and the timeline that we put forward. And so I think we could potentially go down those threads. It might just put a little bit more pressure on the timeline that we talked about.
So the more minimalistic identification idea, what would that tell us about the project? Like aside from, kind of the cryptic name, like what would we understand? Location, cost, a reference to where we could look for more information, I guess. What would your view of that more minimal identification teach us about those projects?
I think that it would certainly identify project name. It would allow us to go back to the rate case in which that project came into rate base and identify kind of costs for that project that went into service. Beyond that, maybe ask if Ms. Jones or Mr. Gage know, what other information might be like at our fingertips on those types of projects.
Yeah, happy to step in here. So I think that you're right on track, Mr. Matley, which is that we'd be able to provide the project name, the location, the scope of the project, probably the cost. And then if it was included in a gas rate case, a reference to where we requested then, commission approval on that project. Beyond that, I think I have the same clarity question that there's information that we could dig up in the hydraulic model regarding those projects. But again, I think we need to understand the level of depth that we want to go for each of those kind of incremental projects that could be interrelated.
Okay.
And also if there's any form of time constraint, like if there's a project potentially in the gas infrastructure plan, even, which is a planned project, not a project that has been in service, if we want to also provide information on that.
Okay. And it sounds like the company kind of may or may not utilize its hydraulic modeling to investigate these relationships, these pulling on the thread to see what else was done in the same area for all intents and purposes, like the same end purpose. And I was curious, anything more you could tell us about how you understand you would kind of thoroughly do that? Because I agree with a lot of what you said. It could be kind of a past or a future. Like, what are we seeing that is all related to this same growth, which is a complicated web. And so just curious, any insights on how you see yourself identifying those and being sure that was a thorough analysis?
Yeah, so interrelated is interesting, right? Because it doesn't always mean geographically related. It really, like you were saying, is about the molecules and what kind of issues on the system that we're seeing. And so as part of the hydraulic analysis, as we have proposed right now, I think you've asked for identification of any upstream impacts. And so as part of the hydraulic analysis, I think we'll be able to identify what type of upstream impacts this individual customer or individual project had. And as such, I think what we would actually do is focus on whether or not we've had a project in the past or proposed that then identifies that or seeks to solve the constraint at that point. So I want to set an expectation that it could be like a project in Denver is the new business project, and we proposed a project in, all the way up north, which is sort of a master project that could have potentially a plethora of new business projects that are related to it. But I think the hydraulic analysis will be very insightful, and we'll be able to pinpoint the areas of the system that were impacted by these new business requests. And then in short, kind of look at what potential projects we've instituted or have planned that address that same constraint.
Okay, so you kind of foresee that look at the hydraulic modeling, at least internally, as a crucial part of identifying these interrelated parts. That's not an extra we hope for. That is like how you would generally do this and make this identification.
I think we would have to, because to my point, geographic location doesn't always mean that it's solving for the same constraint. So we really want to see what underlying constraint each project was solving for. And then that's where we'll be able to find the linkage between capacity expansion projects and new business projects.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. And then as you, in your last, maybe it was your last slide, you showed the 3 sizes of service requests, like less than 1, less than 10, less than bigger number, can't remember. Um, that's for the actual customer. So is it possible most of what we've looked at as these biggest projects for new business would fall into that third category, that largest category of request? Is that like a fair assumption?
Generally, yeah, I think that's a very fair assumption that if it's causing a large gas infrastructure project, it was probably a large request and has been through all of those layers. There is a potential for some of the smaller scale projects like the $1 million mark that they have only gone through a distribution analysis. And in that event, what we do is we kind of roll those up all together during our design day annual planning process and evaluate them as a whole. So it's not that they never get evaluated, it's just they don't get evaluated individually. And so that's part of the challenge in developing this data request is that we are going to go through the effort of trying to evaluate them individually per your request. And so, but it's not readily available right now because that's not part of our current process.
Okay. I've just one other question on the number of projects, and then I'll see if Ms. Older has any questions to round out this discussion. As I think through interrelated projects, like it seems highly likely that a large new business request in 1 year could cascade into a capacity expansion somewhere in the adjacent system in the years to follow or concurrent or something. I'm trying to think through the logistics of like which we pick, if you will. Like if we pick the capacity expansion project that could be related on that same thread, it seems to me you may have less detailed information like directly related to the capacity expansion piece of that with regard to that actual new development, right? Like it seems like the new business request or the new business categorized project will have the most kind of detailed information about the expectations of the customer and the details of the customer and their anticipated load and whatnot. So I'm just trying to think through how if these got linked together, which I think will happen in several cases is like my guess, how do we get the most fulsome information? And I don't want that to be hindered by, well, we picked the capacity expansion one, but if you pull on that thread and there's a new business there that has a lot of detail, more detail than the after the fact capacity expansion. I'm just trying to figure out how we make sure we link the most fulsome information and don't kind of foreclose that by limiting our number of projects and like focusing more on, there seem to be more of the bigger capacity expansion projects. I think that's a given. So, but then I'm worried the new business has more pertinent information, like subject to what the legislature has told us to study.
Yeah, I agree. And let me say that back to you to make sure that we're on the same page and I heard you correctly. So I think what your question is that really the legislation is looking at cause and effect. What happens when a customer requests something? What's the effect on the system? And to your point, for a new business project, we will have much more, identifiable information about what the actual customer request was and what were the residual actions that the company had to take, whether that's a new business project and then eventually a capacity expansion project. So that I agree with you that is true. And I also agree that the reverse is challenging. So when we do have a capacity expansion project, typically it's a collection of new business projects or even new growth, and it could be very expansive. So one particular capacity expansion project could be aiding a plethora of areas in the system because it's a high pressure capacity expansion project. So it'll be much more challenging to identify discrete requests associated with a capacity expansion project than it would be to identify a discrete request associated with a new business project. So to that end, I think, and this is just a suggestion, so bear with me on this, that if you're really looking for cause and effect, it could be more valuable to focus maybe a larger number of the new business projects, and then the capacity expansion projects would be pulled in through that thread you were talking about, which is what is the cause and effect on the system. Does that make sense? Are we thinking the same thing? Yeah.
No, yeah, and I don't really disagree. I was thinking of it in like the opposite way and saying, well, these capacity expansions are the big numbers, right? Like these look major, but I'm worried about the detail of information that you all might say is available with regard to what development caused this. As you said, like could be a little disparate, but if you pull the thread, downstream, there actually are these 3 different or one big new business that occurred in the last rate case, that we do have more detailed information about the expectations and how many units and what's going on, which like might not have at the capacity expansion level. So just trying to figure out how we ensure that that linkage is intact, that like, if that information exists and is readily available, we get it, just as we said, well, this capacity expansion project, but it clearly implies the new business that made it, that caused it, right? That occurred in the somewhat immediate past.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, I thought I was on mute. Yeah, I think you're thinking about it right. I think the challenge for the capacity expansion projects is capacity expansion projects serve a very large area. And therefore, it'll be much more challenging to identify a discrete new business request that tipped us over the edge. And that's one of the challenging things on cost causation, which is what we're trying to investigate here, is that it'll be a really large accumulation of new business requests or even just normal growth that are contributing to a capacity expansion project.
Okay, Ms. Elder, I wanted to go to you just on like, I guess, number of projects, flavor of projects, these categorization, and this interrelated project idea and how those get identified and what we learn about those. So go ahead, Ms. Elder.
Hi. I was trying to turn the video on and I'm not succeeding. Yeah, so I'll give up. I guess I'll give up on that. I'm intrigued by the graphic here on the new business request process. I love this. I'm wondering, and I admit I have to smack myself to remind myself that even 1,000 cubic feet per hour is a significant load on a distribution system. And so I was thinking as I looked at it, no, we're worried about the bigger projects. Like, no, but there's a lot of those smaller ones and they add up. So here's what I'm wondering. Do you by chance have a distribution of how many of the small ones you get per month? How many in each of these three categories? And that would help just give us amplify this sense of how the small ones all add up and get you to that need for perhaps the larger capacity expansion.
I can give you some rough estimates, but they are very rough. And so if we want to include that as part of our follow-up, that would be great. But generally, so the large category, right? Anything above 10 MFCFH, I would say anywhere from like 20 to 50 a month. And that's across our system. And then really anything in that smaller category, so between 10 and 1, we could be talking anywhere from like 100 potentially to maybe a couple hundred per month. Again, very, very rough numbers. And so the majority of it really is those smaller requests, those individual customers, and that's where it gets very challenging to identify the actual customer, because really, like I was saying, it's the accumulation of everything put together that's potentially causing a capacity expansion project.
And is there some place where those smaller ones get accumulated or identified, kind of like you realize you're getting a whole bunch from one place? I mean, does that happen?
Can you reword that question for me one more time?
I'm trying to visualize, put this into a visual perspective. As the smaller requests come in and there are several hundred of them per month, is there some place where like some light bulb goes on in terms of identifying, oh, we're getting a whole bunch from a similar location, something's going on there. That's then going to trigger us. Particularly when we get into the hydraulics and we're seeing a number of, I guess that's probably where it would happen, is when you do the hydraulic analysis. Does that make sense?
I think so. Let me take a stab at the answer and make sure that I'm answering you correctly. So that's really part of our annual design date planning process. So as we're discussing, there's a lot of little customers coming on across the system, maybe some big ones. Each year we recalibrate our model. And that's something that we talk about a lot in our gas infrastructure plan, is we recalibrate our model by bringing in what is the current loading on our system, because we know that we haven't captured every single new business request in our hydraulic model. And so we recalibrate to present day conditions. And in doing so, we use not only customer billing data, which is monthly, but also information from the distribution models that kind of feeds into the high pressure model. And then we evaluate what potential constraints do we have on our system at this point due to all of these different accumulations of growth. And so that's where we're able to identify if potentially a new constraint has popped up. And then we do 10-year planning to see if growth continues, or in some cases, if growth declines, what is the resulting kind of impact to our hydraulic system. And that really is what the process is to lead to our capacity expansion projects. So annual process to make sure that we have everything incorporated. Did that answer your question, Ms. Elder?
I think so. I
Okay.
think so. I mean, I still have this idea that someplace there's a picture where it's like there could be a map, and I'm sticking pins on a map to say request here, request here, request here, request here. Oh, this is going to create a problem. And I don't mean a bad problem. I mean that when we get to the annual design day meeting or process, then we're going to see this pop up.
Yeah, I wish we did have a pretty map with pins, but as we're processing 1,000 per month, you know, that's where it gets challenging. So our source of truth is really our hydraulic
true.
models and the accumulation of all of them together.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Anything else on number of projects, Ms. Elder, or the kind of categorization breakdown?
I don't think so. I
Or I
mean, it
guess
sounds
interrelated, this idea of how we pull on the thread and find the other projects that are serving the same need.
I mean, it sounds like from the 15, we'll end up getting a sense of what the I mean, the company will identify what things got triggered by the 15.
I think both directions, right? Got triggered
Right.
by or triggered.
Right, right. So I think that will be okay.
Okay. Okay, moving on to the next area. I will acknowledge that the company requested to change the dates for compliance. I don't have any specific questions on that yet. I think it may come up as we discuss like different levels of detail and granularity for these different areas, but just wanted to acknowledge that and say I don't have any specific, but I think that the request was clear. I don't have any questions right now. Okay, so I want to get into your red line on changing the observed actual demand to estimated design day peak hour demand, and I'll say this was replicated for residential and commercial, which were two different line items, but we could probably talk to them all together. Okay, so first I wanted to maybe understand at a higher level of the, let's say the 11 projects that we already identified for you, because that's probably an easier set. Which have operated kind of with, you know, new business is probably the most pertinent, but which have operated at their full build out already, like for winter 24-25? Is the company aware of that?
I'm trying to pull up the list in front of me, but I'll make a general statement while I do so, which is that likely if it was in the 2024 gas rate case, it absolutely has not been built out to full capacity for its residential, because typically the builders need the gas infrastructure first, and then we'll phase the build. And so I think it's a pretty fair assumption to say anything in the 2024 gas rate case probably wouldn't be fully built out from a new business perspective. I don't have the exact number of for the other ones that were in the 2021 gas rate case, and it's looking like there's not any on the list. So you focus on 24. Those would be more likely to be fully built out. So as you consider which other ones you might potentially want to include on your list.
Okay. And then for those that are partially built out, would the company have any decent data on how partially, based on what data you have, what percent of the expected load have we already seen and have actual billing data for? I think we're going to have to use 24-25 winter, right? So is that data that you have for each of those projects?
So I can shed some light on that, hopefully, and it also will intertwine with the timeline that we proposed as well. So, for example, we can talk about the Canyons development, right? That was in the 2024 rate case, and I'm certain it's not fully built out yet because I just heard a radio advertisement for it, right? Not that long ago. So, what we have to do to try and pull actual billing data and revenue for that development, we don't have it specifically flagged anywhere in our billing system, right, as associated with Canyons development. It's a premise and an address just like any other in our system. So what we need to do is, draw a boundary in our mapping system, right, around what we understand that development to be, to kind of capture all of the premises associated with the development. And then it's a specific IT request of our billing system to go, to go in and pull that billing data out for that unique list of, say, 1,000 premises. I don't know if that's the actual number, but it's a large development. And once we get that list, we'll have revenue, we'll have a count of, the number of premises there, and we can compare that against what was said to be, the final build out, which is what information we reported in the rate case, and ultimately came from the developers to us. And that'll give us a sense of, how fully developed that development is. And then we'll have to kind of make a determination of, we'll have actual revenue for a portion of the development, and we'll have unknown revenue, relative to what the full build out will look like. And we can kind of, I think, try and calculate and fill in the gap and create a full picture of what revenue from that development could look like. But those processes that I described also, take a number of weeks to work through, just in terms of the business processes that we have. And that's part of the reason why, even though that's information we have available, we still bumped the deadlines out to July and August.
Yeah, no worries. And that process you were talking about that could be done, to my understanding, that is what you're assuming you would do in your red line version.
Yeah,
You would.
and that's what we've gotten started on those 11 projects.
Okay. Can you make it clear to us in that data response what is actual, what is projected, and kind of, so that we are not confused or needing to understand what's been extrapolated and what is the actual, at the date we have the data?
Yes, and I think we can also make it clear what assumptions we used in the extrapolation.
Very helpful. Thank you for that addition. I agree. And then, and if that's done in like an executable document, obviously the executable would be the most helpful to us. So would appreciate that. And then getting to this, so that would be revenue and sales would be contained in that data, I think, for whatever portion was operational, is built out, whatever. Then getting to this peak demands issue. As I understand it, that the company's current practice, and as I understand what you're proposing, is you have premise level monthly data, the CMM, customer management module, then uses an algorithm to determine, okay, from this monthly data, here's the assumption for the peak design day impact, right? Do I have that? It's only been a few
That's
years,
correct.
so I think I've got it now. Okay. So what you're saying is you can give us that. So you would look at, whatever it is, probably the coldest monthly meter read, or however it disaggregates, and say, okay, we still project that this is like the peak demand. But you don't have an observed peak because you don't have any granular data, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I heard Ms. Jones, you say in the intro, like what we asked for, just these 4 things at a minimum from every new project, and one of them is, what is your peak design need? You would have that, I suppose, for each, what their request was, right? And then perhaps this would indicate alignment or lack of alignment, as you take the actual meter reads and say, what is the figurative peak, kind of based off of this information?
Correct.
Okay. Are there any, I honestly forget what they're called, but kind of metering stations or areas in which we could understand on a more granular level with more metering accuracy, like specific geographic areas that are kind of subject to these projects? I'm just wondering if that is available.
Yeah, so typically we probably won't, in terms of directly to a development, have any metering. The bulk of our metering is at our town border stations where we get supply from upstream pipelines, where we have more granular metering. Some places in between on the system, but that's a lot fewer. So I doubt we would have anything directly for any of these developments in terms of hourly data into the whole development.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so it sounds like we can get what their initial request was in terms of peak demand, right? For whatever this development is. We can get from monthly meter reads of premises that exist, have been built, that kind of disaggregation back to the company's projected peak demand. Which is based on the design date condition, which in all likelihood has not happened. I think we can safely say has not happened in the 1 year or 2 years. And then we can also understand kind of the percent build out to try to reconcile these numbers with each other. That all sounds reasonable.
That sounds correct.
Okay. Ms. Elder wanted to see if you had any specific questions with regard to this kind of approximation still of projected peak demand and what we could get and understand there, including with respect to revenue and sales for the portions of the project in service.
That, boy, brain blank. No, I didn't have anything to add. I had one question, which is to remind me our hydraulic modeler, whether that modeling when you do looking at the projects about what the constraint is on the system and how you alleviate that constraint. Is that usually steady state modeling or transient modeling?
Yeah, so that's typically steady state modeling, and then
Okay.
in our mountain area, we'll use unsteady state modeling.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mitchell.
I wanted to note for clarity that on this same issue you're discussing on the observed actual peak demand, when we were prepping for today's session, we realized that we missed one of those edits further down in your decision. In fact, it's in paragraph B11, where that same concept of observed peaked throughput is referenced. And we would want to substitute our same idea we're talking about here for that same reference further below in the decision. So if it's helpful, we can supplement our revised decision again, but just wanted to make sure it was clear that we were proposing the same concept for wherever it says observed actual peak demand, and just trying to be clear in our red lines there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it might be clearer in the record to just make that sub and submit that into this proceeding when we finish here today. Not that I don't understand or trust what you said, but it'll be easier for us to make our edits off of your full version. So yeah, I'd appreciate if you could just submit that minor change. And then also, before I forget, because I will, Mr. Matley, if you could file the slide, that would be great. That would be wonderful.
Happy to.
Yeah. But thanks for the heads up on that. We'll keep that in mind and clearly know that. But if you could submit that, that would make an easier document for us to work off of. Okay, I wanted to get to square footages. It's kind of the next issue that I have on my list. So we had asked for square footages for the residential projects. I'm gonna hit residential and commercial separately because I think this is one area they actually are kind of different in terms of square footage expectation. So wanted to understand, I somewhat regularly pull up the company's application for new service. And as I recall, I thought square footages had been on it. Also, peak demand need, even for residential, had been on it, and now I don't see it on there. So were there revisions to the application that eliminated some of this data that used to be collected or requested?
That's a good question. I think that we weren't reliably getting residential square footage, and as it turned out, that's really not as impactful to our hydraulic modeling as that design day peak hour gas demand. So I can't for certain say when that revision happened, but I can share with you that it's likely that we don't have that information for residential customers. On the flip side, commercial customers, that is something that we're starting to request because we have seen more of a correlation between square footage and design day peak hour gas demand on the commercial side. And so we may have that for some of our applications and some of the projects that we're discussing today, but can't reliably provide that for every single new business request. So in the event that we do have that information, I'm happy to include that. Just wanted to be transparent that won't have that information for every single request.
Okay. Yeah, that's funny. I would think it works the other way. I mean, well, like, yes, there's a huge variation in the size of a commercial building. I would think the loads are very straightforward residentially and should scale by size, whereas commercial should be a little more of a crapshoot what they're using it for. But
so interestingly enough, when a customer comes to us and wants some help kind of evaluating what their design day peak hour gas demand should be on the residential side, we actually focus more on the appliance rather than the square foot, because the appliance will be sized for the square footage and can provide us a little bit more reliable information as to what the maximum design day peak hour gas demand would be. So that's why we don't necessarily use that information on the residential side, but there is more of a correlation, funnily enough, on the commercial side based on how big the actual commercial premise will be.
okay.
A fun fact for you.
Okay, so I'm curious, so if the company doesn't get any square footage data, I mean, understanding appliance as a driver, I'm not even seeing the appliance data is kind of accurately collected in terms of peak demand expectation as in the prior. So I'm trying to understand, what does the company base its assumptions on for that peak demand for new residential if we don't have idea on the size of these premises?
So for residential specifically, and maybe I missed this in my slide, we also ask for the count. And so the number of residential homes, the number of mixed use kind of like residencies, or the number of multifamily. And then we actually allow our customers to provide the first stab at what their design day peak hour gas demand will be. And then typically during that iterative process, that's where we'll go back to the customer. And if it's not really passing the sniff check, or it doesn't really align with what we think a standard loading would be, that's where we could potentially dig into the appliance count a little bit more. But it's a tricky situation, because if they're requesting, 500 MFCFH and we don't design our system for 500 MFCFH, then they just paid for something that we didn't serve them for. And so it's really kind of a more communicative process of iteration with our customer to make sure that the design day peak hour gas demand is reasonable from our point of view, but also what they're expected to use and what they're willing to pay for when it comes to a gas infrastructure reinforcement that they will be customer funded.
Okay. Does the company use any other data, like home energy use survey that I know they do regularly, or like any other outside information to make these assumptions, or it's really all based on this kind of negotiation and quantitative look with the customer?
Another good question that I'm not entirely sure I have an answer for you. Unfortunately, we don't have our design team with us here today, so I could get some more information on that, but I'm not sure if it's a direct linkage to the home usage study, but I do know that we generally have some standardized information that we use as a baseline, so could dig into a little bit more what the source of truth is for that.
Okay, got it. And so I guess it would come up in those discussions with the developer. I mean, if we're talking about a big project, it's a developer. Well, these are much larger than average size homes or much smaller than average size homes. And then you all would work together, from what I'm understanding, to kind of moderate your assumptions around their needs.
Correct.
Okay. Is any of that like recorded or understandable for anyone after the fact? I guess is my obvious need of this information.
It is documented, but with the number of requests that we get, it's kind of, it's included in a system that we use that it's sort of hard to see all the iterative steps. It's much more easy to identify what the final conclusion was. And so with some of the older projects, I think it'll be a little bit more challenging to see all of the iterations. It'll be more so what did they originally apply to and where did we go to, than every single incremental step in between those, just because our documentation software is a little bit challenging, to be completely honest with you.
Okay. With regard to some of these requests, I think some of them are likely linked to like known developments that have names and websites and ways to look at the average size of these places. Does the company have any of that information, those linkages to help like draw any of those relatively easy to make linkages for us?
Well, we have location. So location is pretty helpful when it comes to figuring out who built there. But not always is it the builder that is applying. Sometimes it's the developer, sometimes it's the builder, sometimes it's an individual person. So I think really the location is going to be the biggest kind of indicator of potentially what the outcome was of that build.
Okay. And that would be like for new business, we know a lot more about the location than capacity expansion, where it could be multiple of these downstream developments.
Yeah, we'll know the location of the capacity expansion project, but since typically they're high pressure IP, our system branches off, and so there'll be a lot downstream as opposed to a new business project where we know, geographically exactly where that request took place.
Okay. With regard to the commercial square footage, you had said stronger correlation there in square footage. It also seems to me a wide open field. How big is a commercial building? So is this truly something the company does not have, especially for new business, the square footage of commercial? I struggle to understand how the planning works if we don't know the size of the commercial.
We have now in our current process, so as of 6/6, right, of 2025, we do require the square footage for commercial space. We've required that for a little while. So as I said, I'm happy to provide that for any commercial development that I do know. I just want to temper expectations that there could be a few gaps in the data set depending on the time that they applied.
Okay. Wanted to go to Miss Elder on the kind of square footage question, what we may have or not have, see if you had any other questions for the analysis.
On the square footage specifically, no, I mean, my recollection is that you were using Itron to do your demand forecasting. And my recollection is that Itron's model for commercial is going to be dependent on square footage. So even if the customers, you've got information from some customers now that you've started to collect it, I would sort of expect that there's generic information about square footage that's used in the demand forecast. And, whether at some point those two things square up or not, it would be unclear to me. If I go back to the residential for a second, well, and on the commercial square footage, we'll just see what you've got. And with recognizing there'll be places where it's a blank or not available or whatever, and we'll see what that looks like. On the residential, I'm just curious, when folks come in with their application for new service, and you work with them because maybe their estimate doesn't pass the sniff test, because your folks have a very deep sense, I imagine, of what appliances are going to get installed and what the UEC, and I always forget, uniform energy consumption of that appliance is, and how many of those appliances will be in how many homes, et cetera. Do you find that there's a pattern? Do you see people coming in and underestimating their design day hourly load, or do they typically overestimate it? Or does that just vary randomly? What have you seen?
Good question. I would say it varies, to be honest with you. Sometimes
Okay.
we'll see someone come in and it'll be, wow, there's no way that's going to be that big, or wow, there's no way that's going to be that small. So it really
Okay.
depends on how educated the individual builder and developer is. So I wouldn't say there's a real strict pattern as to what we see.
Okay, so it varies. All right, good to know. I think that's useful. Thank you. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm gonna move along. I will acknowledge you made an edit to strike whether service for an individual or a developer is the reason that you don't know, or if you are aware, can you disclose that for each project?
I think in the event that we are aware, we can disclose that. Again, I think that was more transparency, that it might not always be clear for each application.
Okay, got it. Okay. Moving on to your deletion of, I'm not referring to the sections because some of them changed in your edits, which made things difficult to refer to numbers. Our question, our prompt, describe all scenarios used from hydraulic analysis results request. And so let's see, Ms. Elder, I might just go straight to you to see kind of what questions you would have about what might be available to get us as close to this information as possible.
And I will confess I don't have a copy of the document open.
Okay, let me see. Might be able to pop it up. I don't know if Ms. Federico has it, but do you have it there in front of you? Or do we have, does like Mr. Reitz have sharing capability here? Maybe he could pop up the red line.
Are we talking about the forecasting system mapping, that document?
No, there's another, it's like attachment A to their motion. Which
Right, that had the red line.
Yeah, Mr. Reitz, would you be able to pull that up if Ms. Federico gives you sharing?
If you give me a second, I might be able to find it too. I'll just have to dig through.
Oh,
You guys.
sorry.
I've got it up as well if you want to give me sharing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mr. Malley could share maybe.
Fabulous.
There we go. I've made Mr. Matley co-host so he can share.
Okay. So I think, Mr. Malley, you're gonna want to go to page 9.
Okay, I'll just have to figure out the sharing first.
Of attachment A. Yeah.
The
Sorry.
share button.
Maybe I should have had it. I have too
Okay.
many screens, so I can't be
Well,
multitasking.
Okay.
I'll be
I-
lost forever.
I think I've got it up now. Sorry, which page?
Go to 9.
9.
Is it the attachment? Yeah, you're gonna want the attachment instead, which is the red line. Is this it? Yeah,
This
yeah.
is this
Okay,
is the
perfect.
attachment.
9, yep. So we're looking there in the new 11. Nope, go
The
up
new-
just a
sorry.
little.
Okay.
Yeah, it's that strike of that sentence in the middle. Describe all scenarios.
All scenarios. Is that a problem? As long as we see sort of a begin state or an initial state and a final proposed state, and the difference between those in the hydraulics, that should be okay. In other words, if there were intermediate scenarios that the company analyzed, I guess we could survive without those, as long as we see the beginning and the end. And where the beginning would be without the new construction, and the end would be with the new proposed construction. Those are the two things I think we really care about. Did that make sense, Commissioner?
Makes sense to me. I'm seeing some head shaking. I just want to see if we're in agreement with public service that what you're describing is what they can provide.
Mr. Guyich, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what we also had in mind. Yes.
That's what we're planning.
Okay, got it. So no further questions there. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So as you all are probably aware, we'll get into several of these, but the legislation requires us to evaluate if alternatives could have served this need. So clearly there's some questions about if alternatives could have served these needs. So the first one there in the redlined old 13. I don't get enough practice with my Roman numerals, but oh, sorry, go back up. There you go. About if the requirements, the load could have been served by electric, and you all propose to strike that. So just curious for your rationale in striking that request.
Yeah, so generally, I don't know that we have done this study for each new business request, because when a customer comes to us, we have an obligation to provide them an estimate for gas service. So the first part of this question, could it be solely served by electricity or dual fuel? I took that more as like, would the customer have been interested in that? And we don't have the information to supply for you all. I mean, from a technical standpoint, I think it's relatively obvious that in this day and age, almost any end use could be fully electric or dual fuel. And so I don't know that it would necessarily be required for each individual project. Perhaps we could bring it up a level and talk a little bit more about that at a higher level, that we do believe that the majority, if not all, of end uses could be electric or dual fuel, but we don't have any feedback from the customer about whether or not that would have worked for them.
Right, okay. So you're striking as more customer preference, not knowing, versus a technical feasibility responsibility. On the commercial side, and no disagreement on the residential with regard to like the technical feasibility of serving all these loads with electric. I would agree with you, appears to be there. On commercial, I guess it would be helpful to know if in any of the commercial projects, kind of buttressing the identified projects or projects that will be studied, is the company aware of any specific applications, specific high heat, specialized, customized things that are not technically?
Yeah, I think in the event that we have that information, we can certainly provide it. To your point, there are some industrial processes, right, that potentially don't have an electrification option. I'm hypothesizing that's probably not the case for these new business projects that we're looking at, but we can certainly indicate that if we're aware of a particular application that the commercial customer is using that wouldn't be able to be, in our opinion, served by electric.
Okay, perfect.
An electric appliance.
Given the process you've described, where you somewhat negotiate, help them try and figure out their actual needs, I would presume you might be aware if they have some really specialized giant load that might be more difficult to be served in another way. Ms. Elder, any questions on that aspect? Okay.
Yeah.
The next one that you've struck was if you've conferred with the local electric utility with regard to if they have adequate service in that area. And so I presume your reasoning is you simply did not do this check, did not do this sort of evaluation, but wanted to hear directly from you. Any other explanation here?
No, that's correct. So this predates a lot of our NPA requirements, first off, some of the projects that we're talking about here. And then also it's kind of my understanding that if the customer did want an electrification option and we weren't the electric provider, it would be their responsibility to go to the electric company and see if it had adequate capacity. So that's one of the driving factors behind the reason why we struck this.
Okay. Any questions, Ms. Elder?
No.
Okay, I'll keep going. Okay. Then we've got this one in the middle of our screen regarding disproportionate impact to communities. And I will caveat, actually, most of the legislative language is around income qualified customers. So they don't, we'll have to carve out here our path. And I reread, I could reread it a million times. I'm not memorizing it, but legislative language. And it appears, you know, a lot of the concern, a lot of the analysis that's requested is around us trying to identify the impact specifically on non-participating customers not served by the project, especially income qualified customers who are not served by the project. So this is kind of the inverse of that, how many income qualified or DI customers are served by the project. But this could also help us to understand, you know, the levels of investment in different communities as well. So just want to understand, as the company is looking at, obviously a new business, kind of relatively easy to know where it's serving, capacity expansion, I presume the company kind of has polygons or understanding of this is generally the area that's served by that project. Is that right?
Correct. We can use our hydraulic model to indicate the number of customers directly impacted or served, as we do in our gas infrastructure plan.
Is there any linkage to also understand the number of income qualified customers in that particular batch?
So it's my understanding we do not have income levels for our customers. So in order to have precision in this area, we wouldn't be able to provide that. That being said, we do have the Enviro Screen tool in which you can generally do an overlap between the customers and the Enviro Screen information and potentially come up with a proxy. And I think that's why we intentionally crossed out that last sentence, which is that there's no real level of accuracy as to how many of the customers actually served are DI eligible.
Okay. And there's no linkage kind of within your billing system? Obviously, we use income qualification for a number of things. The company's PIP program and other bill assistance programs, as well as different qualification for, enhanced rebates, things like that. So is there no linkage at all between like how a customer is identified in their kind of premise ID and stuff and their categorization as income qualified?
I would say there's no direct linkage given what we're talking about here. I mean, I think you're correct to say that there are customers that, have applied for and are eligible for certain income qualified programs. And, we know that and we have a record of it. It tends to be in different systems, not directly linked, back to the hydraulic model or back to gas capacity planning. And so that's where, this kind of similar to what I was discussing with getting actual revenue out of the billing system, it sort of comes into this process of, sort of manually extracting custom sets of information out. So it could be possible. And, we were focused on the DI community piece and thinking about the sort of map polygons and census blocks, right? And not the sort of IQ qualification piece. So we can look at that piece as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort it out. I mean, that might be more doable since the DI communities are identified and they might be indicative of IQ levels, in certain areas that might be elevated or different. As we look at this in a larger sense, especially given, this one I think we're going to struggle with because there's a specific legislative directive here that we must identify the impact to a certain subset of customers. Does the company have good data they could submit to us with regard to the total number of IQ customers on the system at large?
I'd subject to check. I would think we would have the total number.
Okay. Because I'm just trying to sort out this legislative directive that says we need to need to really identify the impact on those customers specifically, especially those not in the project area. So I think in doing so, we would need to know how many of them there are, like how much of the rate classes are comprised of the individuals in which we're supposed to make this calculation.
Right, because ultimately, the impact to non-participating customers of these projects is generally the same for each customer, within each rate class, sort of as costs get allocated out through rate case in our, average rate structure. So I think I see where you're headed. And yes, like the number of income qualified customers would, get a proportion of that impact.
Yeah, yeah, okay. I'm just trying to sort out as we rule on this, like what is the specific legislative need here and how can we get as close as possible with the information you do have if you don't have any flags in your system to understand the number of IQ customers specifically served, you might have to calculate this at a higher level, specifically focused on that non-participating piece, assuming any given project doesn't serve a ton of customers. The vast majority of IQ customers in your system are not served by any given project directly, right? I think is where I'm trying to figure out.
And the numbers we have would be a proxy for the total number of IQ customers, because ultimately, we know the number of customers enrolled in programs that require income qualification, which many of those programs, or I think all of those programs were not the income qualifier for.
Right. Okay. All right. So this might look like, trying to work with you all more on like overlaying the polygons of what's really served by a project and DI communities to kind of infer maybe different levels of IQ customers in those areas, but also, don't be shocked if we go there with trying to solicit like the total number of IQ customers on the gas system at large to get to this bigger question that the legislature's asked, I think. Okay. Ms. Elder, other questions with regard to the IQ or DI piece?
No.
Okay. Okay. Going down just a little, ancillary benefits, kind of toward the bottom of this page is struck here. And I think to us, this is really just, statute requires us to consider costs and benefits of the project. So I think we're trying to ensure that we have an understanding, especially from your perspective, on the total accounting for those costs and benefits. So, any feedback? I mean, if you say there are none or we can't calculate that, that's kind of some of what'll go into the calculation. So just want to check in with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think when we looked at this, it's more of an instance of this isn't the type of analysis that we do, right, on the new business projects that come in the door. That ultimately, this is certainly considerations for the customers and the developers who apply, but ultimately, they take these considerations into account and then they apply for the service that we're requesting, and it's really our focus and responsibility on how to provide that service.
Okay. Any questions, Ms. Elder, on that ancillary?
No.
Okay. All right, we'll keep going down, Mr. Matley, if you can keep driving, bring us to the next. The next issue that I had was in this, oh my goodness, 18? 18, cost service and rates models, identifying how those specific projects that have been identified or that will be studied influence or change the revenue requirements. So am I reading correctly in like maybe it was in your presentation today that your hesitation to do this is you don't know the O&M impact, or help me understand why we don't know the revenue requirements of known capital projects.
So it's less the O&M issue, and it's more the case that when planning this projects, it's generally not our practice to develop a cost of service and rates model around a specific project. Ultimately, we evaluate the capital expenditure associated with any given project, and once that project is complete, that ultimately the capital expenditure goes into service and becomes an addition to rate base in the next rate case that's compiled with many other projects together into one cost of service model that's brought forward in a rate case to evaluate, the company's revenue requirement and ultimately revenue deficiency. And so we can and will and are planning to put together a cost of service model around each project. And that's similar to the exercise we just did for the gas infrastructure plan and, meeting the requirements of those rules to provide a revenue requirement on a project basis. But we're going to be doing that, based on the information that we have today, which obviously includes the amount of capital that went into service in those previous rate cases. But we don't really have it in the context of those rate cases. We didn't do the individual project revenue requirement in those rate cases. So we were really trying to focus this data request element around just providing one cost of service, revenue requirement model for each project.
Ms. Elder, question? I see you mulling.
You could see my mouth hanging open. I think what I heard, or maybe I should ask a question instead of saying what I think what I heard. For the project, when you file an application with the commission, we want to do this project. Does it not include a breakdown of how the CapEx gets amortized into the revenue requirement for the next, I don't know, X years?
So for nearly all of these projects, we weren't at the time required to file an application before we proceeded with the project with the commission. I mean, those rules have changed over time, and we're doing that more with the gas infrastructure plan that we put in just last month. And we have a separate CPCN application in the Mountain Energy project, and that requires a revenue requirement calculation, which provides the amortization and provides the revenue impact over time. But for these projects, they were designed and put into service for the most part before those rules came into play, or were below the thresholds of those rules. And so for that, the first revenue requirement for those projects is done in the rate case to put them into rates after they've gone into service. And it's just done as part of the overall rate case revenue requirement. So we don't have a on the shelf kind of specific to the project revenue requirement.
In the rate case, so I had the impression that of the projects that we were asking for information about, each one of those had been identified in a rate case.
Yes.
And and then my recollection was that there was a cost associated with each.
Yes, and what's identified at the project level in the rate case is the capital expenditures. And that's the capital the company has spent to put that project into service. It's then rolled up into a revenue requirement overall, but we lose the project detail in that roll-up process.
Gotcha. Okay, I understand. I'm trying to think how to do what I want to do.
Well, maybe is it possible to more describe what it is you want to do, and we could think through, if there's available options?
Well, I think as long as we have the CapEx identified, we can use the method, the general approach that's in the latest rate case to say this is how we think this would have turned into a project-specific revenue requirement.
Well, and maybe let me clarify. We're planning to create a project-specific revenue requirement
for each of
the identified projects. So the thing we're striking is the direct link to those rate cases, because we really don't have it. What we can put forward is based upon when those capital additions occurred, we can generate a project-specific revenue requirement, and we can do that in line with the capital assumptions in the or the approved weighted average cost of capital in the last rate case, and run that forward for the life of the project. So we can provide that. It just is a new creation that's not directly linked into those rate cases.
Right, okay. And so with that, we would be able to basically turn the projects on and turn the projects off and see the impact, the change in the revenue requirement and rates.
You would be able to see the direct impact of, in each year, the revenue that's baked. Well, let me back up. So you would be able to see the level of revenue in each year associated with each project. It's not a direct rate impact because rates only change in every rate case. So it's a reasonable proxy, but rates in effect for customers would
Yeah, it's a
change at a point
proxy.
in time in a future case.
Okay, Ms. Elder, other questions? I know you're.
I know I'm
But
chewing.
it sounds like we will get a model, get a number that shows like the approximate revenue
Approximate
requirement for the
impact.
project. It's just, it's not vintage from these rate cases. It was created now to set aside this requirement with everything we know now with the best assumptions they can put to it, is my understanding.
Right, and you can't go back, recognize one cannot go back to that 2022 rate case, and in that cost of service model, you won't find this information broken out this way.
Right.
Which is, I mean, that's reality. So, okay.
Okay. All right, we'll move along to the next one. Sorry. I have one a little out of order on my list and I'm trying to figure out where it is. Where's the reference? On the I have 18B as like the location of what I was gonna go to.
Is it 20B?
Yeah. But like, is it the old? Anyway, maybe I think it will jog your memory anyway. The company had proposed to strike, I think, identifying projects added downstream of the so this would be like specific to capacity expansion. The company wanted to strike identifying projects added downstream. So these are the old numbers, old BI. Yeah, sorry for jumping around, but I wanted to get to this one. That strike and I add projects added downstream of the identified project in the 5 years prior. And so getting to like our discussion on capacity expansion, how it's not just this one thing. Sometimes it's a bunch of projects that have come together and made this need. I think we thought that would be useful, certainly, to execute on this statutory directive to really understand how development has been driving it, with the acknowledgement that capacity expansion projects are not always immediate development. It's sometimes, an accumulation of things that have happened in the recent past to cause that project. So I was just curious on the company's rationale for striking that, as I see it getting to part of essentially what we need to make that linkage.
So to make sure we're on the same page, I'm reading this not about the projects downstream, but you want the number of customers downstream of the project 5 that have been added over the past 5 years.
That's correct. In acknowledgement that the capacity expansion issue doesn't crop up overnight. It's this development that has happened in the recent past that generally causes it to occur.
So I think actually, oddly enough, it's easier to identify the number of projects downstream than actually the number of customers that came on downstream. And that's just because of the vintage of our data. So we are constantly updating our data in order to identify how many customers are on our system now. And so what we can do is we can do a poll as of today, the number of customers directly impacted or served. But going back, how many of them were added over the last 5 years is incredibly challenging because we don't necessarily archive that data each year. And so it's the physical amount of how many customers came on over the last 5 years that is challenging. We can provide the projects, but maybe not the difference in the actual customer count.
What about number of applications for new service in the area served by the project? That would be a tangible thing you have, right?
That is an interesting idea that I'm trying to think through, so bear with me on this one. So your request is for a capacity expansion project, anything downstream, could we identify the number of requests that we've received in that particular area over 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, if you know how many requests were successful and you actually supplied, like, great. But I'm just trying to get to this, you know, I think there's a very obvious linkage. The legislature wants us to study, and with a capacity expansion project, I can't do that with just the customers that came online right now. Like, I have to know who, what built to this. So trying to figure out what data could get there.
Yeah, I may need to phone a friend on this one to see how that may be physically possible. But I do understand your intent that we need some way to quantify, you know, what was the growth, what happened over the last 5 years, that, you know, the effect of this capacity expansion project. So if you don't mind, I might need to phone a friend on that one. I'll see if I can get an answer now.
Yeah, see if you can get an answer today. Like, what proxy, what could teach us? What was the development? What was the growth in that area? Maybe it's applications. I would hope we can sliver that to successful applications, like actually developed, so that we're being accurate. But I'm just trying to figure out how do we get something that you would have that can teach us. I think a link we need to make specifically for capacity expansion projects.
Okay, let's see if I can get an answer before we're done here in 20 minutes.
Okay, great. No worries. Okay. Now let's go back up just a little, Mr. Matley, to the beginning of this section. I know there's a big up more. You'll see a bunch of red. There you go. Okay.
That's
It's the easiest way to describe it. Okay, getting into the some of the analysis and comparison that we're required to do under the legislation. So the company has provided this suggestion or this edit on completing, I think, as you call it, a simplified cost benefit or kind of alternative analysis. So I wanted to get, you know, and perhaps by way of clarification, I will recognize your edit has you doing the evaluation. I think the legislation requires us to do the evaluation. So I will just point out maybe that difference. And the way our questions were posed was data collection for the evaluation. And I will just note that your edit changes that to you doing the evaluation, which may be a more major change. So with regard to I here, the cost of the MPA portfolio is equivalent to that of the gas infrastructure project. Help me understand what would substantiate that sort of assumption.
Really, the basis of that assumption is that if an NPA portfolio was to be successful, it couldn't have been dramatically larger than the actual investment that we made on the gas infrastructure project in order to be cost effective. And so we were trying to simplify of not necessarily looking down to each NPA measure level and just saying, you know, and I'll use an example. The company spent $1 million on a gas infrastructure project. We could have theoretically spent that same $1 million incentivizing customers to go all electric. So we felt like that was a reasonable way to like kind of set the stage of the company investment is the same in each scenario, in lieu of actually looking at what individual customers would have needed in order to convert, because that's where it gets challenging, is when we have to start digging into what is the achievable potential in this area, particularly in a retrofit environment.
So if we're doing a cost benefit analysis of alternatives, being like gas infrastructure project or alternative, and our first assumption is the things cost the same, doesn't that kind of predetermine that at a very high level, a cost benefit analysis would not show any benefits of an alternative, because our number one assumption was there's no benefit, it costs the same?
So maybe to add a little bit more context here in terms of where this idea came from. Ultimately, we were struggling a bit with sort of what the alternative analysis requirement and statute sort of indicated. And one of the main pain points in putting together our evaluation of the data analysis was the amount of time it's going to take to do the NPA analysis to determine what the technical potential, achievable potential, the portfolio, and we would ultimately be doing that sort of in hindsight on these projects. Obviously we've already installed a gas infrastructure project. I don't know if many of these projects started before we had these NPA requirements. I don't know if, any of the NPA analysis would have turned out cost effective. Ultimately, for the new business projects, we have developers that requested gas and, didn't request electric, or didn't request all electric, I should say. And so what we thought might be sort of most helpful and most productive, if we made this simplifying assumption, we could take a lot of the hours of work required to develop the NPA portfolio out, but we could still look at the cost impact to non-participating customers of the NPA versus the gas infrastructure project. And that might be the instructive and helpful sort of conclusions or analysis to undertake to meet the requirements of the statute, depending on how you interpret it. And so we thought this could be a simplifying assumption that sort of moves us away from hindsight analysis and into understanding the downstream impacts of, honestly, the different cost recovery structures for NPAs and for gas infrastructure projects.
Okay. Ms. Elder, any questions?
No, I think you nailed the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all know, our task in SB 291 is to identify the upfront and service life annualized costs and benefits of alternatives. So I think we will need to sort out what a rigorous and accurate depiction of those would look like. Okay, for the II, the resulting incremental electric demand is assumed to be equivalent to capacity shortfall, though software from the gas infrastructure project. So you're just multiplying by, dividing by 3,412. We're just converting BTUs to kilowatt hours here, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so that would inherently assume I'm trying to figure out what that inherently assumes for efficiency of appliances, of heating devices. I mean, clearly on the electric side, it's implying a COP of 1,
Yep.
which I understand from many filings is the company's assumption at Fitz and Peak. Trying to figure out what it implies on the efficiency of the gas side of that equipment, because there are inefficiencies on the combustion on the customer side. So I can do that with a spreadsheet. I'm just trying to, like, in my head, figure out what the implied assumed efficiencies are here. I mean, I get the converting therms to a BTU thing, but I think there are several implied efficiencies here we'll need to think through. I wasn't sure if you had thought through those and had any insight for me.
Yeah, so this would be our as modeled design day peak hour gas capacity shortfall. So the efficiencies will vary based on, like, if you actually looked at efficiency measure, but this would be the aggregate of what the hydraulic model is telling us we're short. We are short 10 MFCFH. And so in order to avoid that gas infrastructure project, we're assuming that entire value converts over to electric. So I think the efficiency of the gas load is going to vary, but it's more the aggregate number that the system would need to supply in order to avoid any shortfall at design day.
That's fine,
make
but
sense
if
to you?
every gas load's operating at 85% efficiency, the aggregate compounds.
To about 85 probably, right? But some would be higher, some would be lower, but that's generally based on the customer billing data and what we're getting out of CMM and their actual, demand that we're estimating in the model. How short are we? And that's the amount that we would need to convert over to electric in order to avoid the gas infrastructure project.
Okay. you don't geographically track like DSM implementation of say like more efficient gas appliances, et cetera, do you?
I do think that when we offer a rebate, we do have information on location. I believe that I've seen that data before.
Okay, so it is possible you would understand at least the number of rebated, upgraded appliances in certain geographic areas?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Ms. Elder, any follow-up questions in this area? Sticking to that one.
Nothing more.
Okay.
And Commissioner, I do have an answer for you on the last
Yeah.
question. If we can wait until the end, but did want to just
No, go for
mention
it.
I have an answer. Well, I was kindly reminded by the wonderful gas team here at Excel, so apologies for my ignorance, it slipped my brain, that when we do a customer poll from our GIS software, it has the in-service date. So we'd be able to very clearly see if they came on within the last 5 years. So crisis averted on that particular issue. So when we provide the number of customers directly impacted or served as of today, we would be able to filter out the ones that came on within the last 5 years.
Okay. And so then with regard to your red line on that one, is what I'm hearing that you can readily provide the information, and therefore perhaps
Correct.
your red line there is de-emphasized. I don't know,
Correct.
maybe how to use that is gettable data now from our understanding.
Yeah, and I'm making a list of a few things that we've agreed upon. And if we're going to file an amended version anyway, potentially there's some language we could put in to clarify some of the things that we've talked about today. So I'll make a note of this one as well.
Yeah, if you're doing it anyway and you have these things we know we can get, that's helpful, simplifies our red lines, our side of things as we're sort through each of these different issues and come to that ruling with
Agreed.
the hearings starting on Tuesday. So yeah, any help sorting out what we've already gotten to and agreed upon would be really great. Okay. All right. Okay. So I will acknowledge, like from here on down, and I will say in the company's motion, you indicated that this XX, the 20, was the vast majority of time, I think, as you characterized it in your concerns. And so, you know, as I understand it, and your timeline assumes your red lines, more or less.
Correct.
Okay. And so just looking at these, I will acknowledge there are a lot of these, and I think we'll sort through these different CBA characteristics. I mean, a lot of these were also kind of extensively discussed in the recent docket on CBAs for gas projects. So I don't intend to go through all of the merits of all of those here today. Let me see if
and not to interrupt you, but I think our assumption for this is that we would be providing our CBA tool for each of these projects. I do want to clarify because I believe that I heard you say that you would be calculating cost effectiveness. So is the expectation that we would provide you our version of our CBA, which has some of this stuff included, and then you would take that with, do with it what you will, but is that the expectation here? I could use that clarification. Okay.
We can clarify in the ruling next week. But I do think that is the expectation. I mean, I think the legislative language directs us to do it. So I wouldn't give you the assumption that we will be taking whatever you give us and passing it off as our own work and blessing it in its entirety. But I think clearly that provides your view of the appropriate assumptions, of the appropriate calculations, and then we would be analyzing that as part of our analysis, basically.
Okay, we are aligned. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so I'm not going to go into every CBA thing. I think we've requested the data in a certain way. I think it seems somewhat clear you might provide it in a different way, and then we'll do that analysis. One other question in the areas where, I think we're clear, kind of where you don't have things or what we have. So, Ms. Elder, other questions while we're here?
About this topic or a different one?
Yes, start on CBA if you have CBA questions, but then I think we're prepared to go to other topics you might have questions on as well.
I don't. I need to go back to one, if
Okay.
I may.
Let's go back.
That would be it was Roman 11, I think, on the hydraulic modeling, where you talked about the before and the after analyses, and we struck this sentence about describe all scenarios analyzed. And I wanted to clarify if the company's intent in striking that sentence was because it didn't keep track of everything that it analyzed.
I don't want to say we don't keep track of everything we analyze, but generally for a new business project, really the indicator is how was the system before? We might iterate a little bit, but then what really is the system after? And that's the best representation of why we kind of prescribed the gas infrastructure project in question. And so there really isn't multiple scenarios in which we kind of looked at different avenues. It's the one model of truth that led us to the proposed gas infrastructure project.
I appreciate that. And I wasn't interested necessarily in every iteration of how you got to the final outcome, but I do know that sometimes in sitting with the model, we'll go, well, what if we did this instead? Would that work? And so somewhere in here, what we're leaving out with the before and the pre and the final is that we're not getting any sense of, was there something else that could work?
So I'm trying to read through this specifically because in my opinion, and I'm happy to be wrong, XI is really talking about what is the output of the hydraulic model that led us to the proposed gas infrastructure project, and that just is what it is. Whether we considered multiple gas infrastructure projects to solve that need is something a little bit different. And I think I'm hearing from you that your question is, was there an alternative gas infrastructure project that maybe would have worked, but would have been a different way to solve the same problem? Am I understanding that correct, Ms. Elder? Okay.
Yes, you're correct.
And I'm wondering if perhaps that's covered in a different bullet point and not necessarily this one specifically. And I'd need to remind myself if I'm being completely honest. Let's see. Regardless, I suppose, though, if we do have information on what alternative projects could have been an option in regards to like an alternative gas infrastructure project, I certainly think that's something we could provide if it's not prescribed already in this order point. That causes me no pain. In some cases, that information may be a little bit harder to find, but certainly if we have it, we'd provide it.
Thanks. Thank you, Commissioner. That's what I realized I had left out.
Okay, no worries. The hydraulic analysis is far more your wheelhouse than mine, so happy to have you direct what we need. Any other questions, Ms. Elder, on the red lines?
I do not have any.
Okay, all right, excellent. Anything in closing from you all, Mr. Matley, Ms. Jones?
Nothing else. I think that just other than to say, appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion and to, work through where we were coming from, and hopefully it can land us in a better spot.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, really appreciate you, you all coming today and sharing this with us. I didn't give you any time back in your jacket. It's exactly 11, but I do think we got through the whole agenda. We got through each of the items. I have one follow-up question kind of at the end in terms of if there's data, that we had seen as helpful to our analysis, but the company simply doesn't have it. Is the company willing to kind of more formally stipulate that they do not have some of that data, or would that be implied? If something's on the list and you say we don't have.
I guess I was thinking that was implied in the motion, where we struck. And so I think we discussed, obviously updating that motion for, some of the corrections that we'd like to make. And also I think maybe we can make it more clear, where there's maybe a couple of those red lines that we could provide where available instead of a kind of direct strike. But I think we were interpreting the strikes as sort of a formal notification that we don't have that data.
Okay. Okay, hopeful. Well, thank you. So just for some to-dos, Mr. Motley, I think you will submit those slides into the record. And then as soon as you're able to provide those red lines, it sounded like Mr. Manshall had one more in an area, and then kind of that idea of reflecting any agreement or moderation to a few of the areas today based on what we understand could be a proxy or could be available would be very helpful. We've got to start working on this more or less right away, given hearing all next week. So the sooner we get that, the better. That would be very helpful as a working starting point from us. And we'll be working on this over the next week, and I think you could expect some resolution on this next week from me. So just wanted to very much thank my team here who helped pull this all together and compare your requests and try to understand where we are with this in really short order, as well as all of you. I know everyone's incredibly busy, our staff included, but wanted to keep this moving. I want to get this legislative study completed in the best way we can. So really appreciate you all jumping on the call. I think we sorted out a lot of stuff a lot faster than we would have otherwise. So I very much appreciate your efforts in being here. So thanks so much for that. We'll look out for that filing. And yeah, thanks so much. And I will say we are adjourned for today. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much.